and this is the Thunder Channel on nootropics, on testosterone, on anything that we can take that makes us feel, perform, and function good, but that is also within reason. I am your host, Ryan Michael Ballo. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Hit the bell to get notified of all the content I'm pushing out and live streams. If you get the YouTube app, it'll notify you in real time. A couple products support this broadcast. I'll explain them later, but just to introduce you, we have two nootropic stacks that I invented. First is the Cortex stack. Second is the Torque stack. You can get them both in the description below or at livecortex.com. Lastly, I am a biohacking consultant. I've helped many men, now in the thousands, achieve significant energy, reduction of brain fog, full-on nootropic regimens, and a host of other things. You can hire me in under a minute at livecortex.com. Okay, friends, so Mucuna Pruriens, dangerous or a godsend? This is actually something that I wanted to address for the longest, because right off the bat, yeah, I take Mucuna a lot, probably 4 times a week. Sometimes I'll cycle off of it, but I mean, largely there's usually Mucuna in my supplement regimen, and that's because it makes me feel really awesome, gives me a lot of motivation, and makes me function pretty good. Now, a lot of people on the web you're going to find write off Mucuna completely, because of the reputation that it has. Specifically, how people allude to one dangerously bad thing that Mucuna can supposedly do, and that is desensitize dopamine receptors. Let's take a look. One user in a Facebook nootropics group, when asked about whether or not Mucuna was bad to take, in a thread titled, "Oh my god, all these negative experiences, is Mucuna all that bad?" responded with the following: "I don't know, my dopamine receptors are messed up. Made me trip one time, another time made me very angry." Another user responded, "Its daily use is not sustainable long term because of the risk of dopamine downregulation, and it can be too much of a push over the cliff's edge for some people." I mean, what? Super general. I'll get to that. Another user noted, "Mucuna can be very dangerous since it influences the dopaminergic system directly. This can lead to dire consequences very easily." Oh, I can't. A much safer option would be L-tyrosine, which has to be converted on a need basis first to dopamine by your body, so you end up needing not to worry if you're putting yourself at risk, developing some sort of dependence. Another user on Reddit said, "I'd be careful with Mucuna." Oh yeah, somebody told me yesterday to stop doing that. Sorry. I'm a fidgeter. Another user on Reddit said, "I'd be careful with Mucuna Pruriens. I specifically remember seeing the Nootropics Depot owner mention that he doesn't offer that product because of certain damaging effects it has." And the last user that we'll cover today noted, "The brain craves homeostasis, so I see no reason to assume that increases in dopamine everywhere wouldn't have the usual downregulation of receptor response." So what do all these reports or whatever and warnings have in common? They have in common the highly perpetuated idea that Mucuna Pruriens will dysregulate the dopamine system, specifically in desensitizing dopamine receptor sites.
So what's my take on the matter?
Is the dopamine receptor downregulation theory one which is often spoken about with a lot of confidence on the web? Is that true? The answer is no. That's false. Look, Mucuna Pruriens extract contains usually between 5 and 15% of Ldopa, naturally occurring, but it's also combined with hosts of other compounds in sort of a symphony of effects, which include but are not limited to anti-diabetic, aphrodisiac, anti-neoplastic, anti-epileptic, antimicrobial activities, anti-venom activities, and neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory properties. But this is the common logic around Mucuna. The common logic is Mucuna equals raw Ldopa in the brain, which equals the synthesis of more usable dopamine, which is true, which eventually leads to the desensitization or the downregulation of dopamine receptors. Now, the real question is that true? Because if it is, Mucuna is not safe to take. It's dangerous and you shouldn't take it. So let's take a finer look. Common theory surrounding Mucuna Pruriens is that Mucuna is akin to pharmaceutical Ldopa, which is a very potent bioavailable form of levodopa, which over the course of years of consistent use, as in the case with some of the diseases it's used to treat, like Parkinson's disease, can actually desensitize dopamine receptors. But Mucuna, being a whole host of other constituents kind of in one interesting supplement, usually standardized to between 15 and 20% of the very high end of Ldopa, is not akin to pharmaceutical Ldopa, not even close. Next, though, I think, one has to step back and get a little nuanced about like what this target negative outcome is. The target negative outcome is the desensitization of dopamine receptors. It's important to look in the literature and really, really go and research and figure out like what exactly does, hello, my screen time was up 42% last week from an average of 7. Wow. That's interesting. It's important for you to understand exactly how dopamine receptors get desensitized, right? You wouldn't want to just like read web anecdotals and go, oh, Mucuna desensitizes dopamine receptors. You want to see what actually can desensitize dopamine receptors and try to figure out how that works and then compare those two chemicals together. So I'll point us to a paper titled Resistance to Dopamine Agonists in Pituitary Tumors, Molecular Mechanisms, in which they're studying people who have used very hardcore pharmaceutical dopamine agonists, again, something that's very different than Ldopa and certainly Mucuna on like a power spectrum, where they conclude, in conclusion, the pharmacological efficacy of dopamine agonists used for the medical treatment of pit nets, which are pituitary tumors, is based on several multifaceted mechanisms mainly investigated in prolactinomas. These mechanisms include the reduction of D2DR expression, which are dopamine receptors, regulated by internalization and downregulation processes orchestrated by cytoskeleton proteins and B arrestins, changes in the proportion of dopamine receptor D2 receptor subtypes, regulation of cell signaling pathway of D2DR, and the increase in angiogenic and fibritic markers. So basically what they're even saying is in response to dopamine agonists, the efficacy of those dopamine agonists, the implication is their potential desensitization, and the desensitization or the resistance to some of these compounds that are used to treat pituitary tumors, which are dopamine agonists, actually have certainly to do with dopamine D2 receptor expression, but like hosts of other factors. That's what that paper is saying. Another paper, which kind of zeroes this in a little more clear for you folks, titled Management of Dopamine Agonist Resistant Prolactinoma. So this is a case where someone has a pituitary tumor. The standard treatment for that is dopamine agonist because pituitary tumors express a bunch of D2 receptors like on their physical structure. And the way to essentially shrink pituitary tumors is to bind directly to the dopamine receptors with dopamine agonists. This paper tells us that a very small subset of patients that have pituitary tumors, which express high amounts of D2 receptors and are treated with D2 agonists, strong pharmaceutical dopamine agonists, do develop resistance to those dopamine agonists. It says the overall prevalence of dopamine agonist resistance is 20 to 30% for bromocriptine. That's one of the dopamine agonists that's pretty short-lived, so it really only has I think the half-life is like 6 hours or so. It's pretty much out of your system like either that day if you take it in the morning or the next day. And around 10% for Cabergoline, which is a very different dopamine agonist that has very long-acting, long high-affinity binding properties to the dopamine receptors. They say maintaining maximal CAB dose, which is Cabergoline doses at 3.5 milligrams, may lead to progressive hormonal control in a significant portion of patients. That's pretty good. Complete resistance to CAB, one of the most powerful dopamine agonists in the world, and resistance would implicate dopamine receptor desensitization, is infrequent. In a study of 122 patients with a macroprolactinoma, which is a pretty big-sized pituitary tumor, only 7 of those 122 people, which is 6%, could not achieve control over prolactin despite maximal Cabergoline doses for greater than 12 months. A large resistant prolactinoma is also an indication for transsphenoidal surgery. Okay. What does that paper tell us right there? And this is why it's important to go look at context and how dopamine receptors are actually desensitized. It tells us that for long stints of taking perhaps the most powerful dopamine agonist in the world, Cabergoline, judged by their utility in the use of like Parkinson's disease, only 7 out of 122 patients ended up with a resistance to Cabergoline. That's 6% of the patients in that study. Now, I don't know if you've ever taken Cabergoline before, but I have, and I've studied it very extensively. Cabergoline is one of the heaviest, most aggressive agonists with high affinity that bind to the dopamine D2 receptors that you could get, that ever existed. It's like derived from ergot alkaloids. It's extremely long-acting and has a half-life of like 70 hours or something. And the prolactin lowering effect of it can be noted up to 21 days after administration. So like that's a very, very serious, long-acting, very potent D2 receptor agonist, cut and dry. And even in that case, with greater than 12 months of use, I think the common use is about 3.5 milligrams, which is actually very high. Most people dose 0.5 milligrams twice a week on that stuff. Only a small percentage of people develop resistance to it, which implies desensitization of dopamine receptors. So you got this compound called Cabergoline, which is literally inhabiting dopamine receptors 15 to 21 days. And still, in this context, with one of the most powerful dopamine agonists in the world, only 6% of people develop a resistance to it, which is only theorized, by the way, in the literature to have to do with dopamine receptor downregulation. It's not actually proven super conclusively. So then, another thing you have to consider when looking at all this is you have to think about the brain and how the brain works. So let's talk about that. Brain is a pretty fascinating organism, but which does have like scores of homeostatic regulatory mechanisms kind of inbuilt, which when taking something innocuous like Mucuna pruriens or even L-tyrosine will work to regulate the receptor response and the dopamine clearance, the clearance of dopamine from the minor amount of usable L-Dopa, which gets converted into dopamine. This will not cause dopamine receptor downregulation. It's just not going to happen. And considering that it took 12 or more months of very high doses of one of the most potent dopamine receptor agonists in the world to develop resistance, which is not proven as dopamine receptor downregulation, but probably is, it's a pretty safe bet to say that Mucuna pruriens is safe to take. But hey, what do I know, right? I'm just some guy here on YouTube. Let's say you don't trust me for a second. Let's get the internet's take and look at some anecdotals. In a thread titled, "Anyone that's taken Mucuna pruriens for long term," a user noted, "I've been taking 50 milligrams of Ldopa via Mucuna 5 days a week for 4 to 5 years. Feel great, even on the weekends. That's my 2 cents. Another user states, "I take it on and off for more than 2 years. I haven't experienced any unwanted effects. 15% Ldopa, about 120 milligrams. The side effects probably occur in high doses, as many anecdotal posts here. I was taking a spoonful a day," they say. "Also in studies, 30 grams of Mucuna pruriens is used and is better tolerated than synthetic Ldopa." Now that guy makes a great fucking point. It is actually true that a lot of the negative side effects associated with Ldopa is synthetic Ldopa, which again is very, very different from the very little bit of Ldopa that you're going to get from Mucuna pruriens. Another user goes, "I took 800 milligrams of Mucuna pruriens daily for 3 weeks. Okay, I'll give it to you. Not a long time. Haven't taken it for 4 days. Don't feel any withdrawals or negative symptoms." In another thread titled, "Long-term Mucuna, is there any evidence that it's harmful or risky?" Good question to ask. Where is the evidence? In which user states, "It's a lot of scaremongering. I've seen people seriously profess that 120 milligrams of Ldopa is worse than 50 milligrams of Vyvanse. Ridiculous," he goes. "And these misunderstandings come with the fact that it's used in Parkinson's in very, very high doses for years before negative side effects can occur." Great fucking point. It's like, in those kind of comments, we're getting to the truth of the matter and the actual logic, the logical frame through which you should look at this. Yet another user states, "I cycle it 8 weeks on, 4 weeks off. Have been doing this for 1.5 years with no ill effects so far." Another user who uses it long term states, "Hello, I've taken it long term. Don't fear the tyrosine hydroxylase boogeyman, which is that when you take lots of Mucuna for a long period of time, you can desensitize or downregulate tyrosine hydroxylase, which is probably true. But if you're taking Mucuna, you wouldn't really need a whole lot of tyrosine hydroxylase to be converting like tyrosine into Ldopa because you have the Ldopa. That's actually a natural response of tyrosine hydroxylase to desensitize, which upregulates when you stop taking Mucuna. And again, this is very high doses, not your standard doses in a supplement. I've never experienced withdrawal and don't read much about it. I don't know. I take it for lowering cortisol and keeping neurotransmitters up. It keeps ADHD at bay. It even keeps serotonin at a healthy level. So what is the moral of the story? The moral of the story is, Mucuna pruriens is not dangerous to take. I take it, usually again, like 4 times weekly. And I've done that on and off for I want to say 5-6 years. I've taken Mucuna somewhat regularly. I don't have any side effects. I don't have any desensitization issues. I don't have any anhedonia when I come off of it. Pretty much nothing. I think the only ill effect that I do have from Mucuna, which, if I take too high doses of it, I can run into this effect, is I get a tad edgy and I kind of just don't feel right. Like I just feel overstimulated, kind of edgy, kind of nervous type of feeling. And that's probably because it's raising neuroadrenaline a little bit. So if I take any more than like 800 milligrams of a standard Mucuna supplement, I end up feeling a little edgy. But it's like, why are so many people cautioning against the use of it? I'll tell you why. Because this is how the internet is. Ready? It's like Joe reads Jack's misguided warning of Mucuna. Pick any one of the, earlier misguided warnings of Mucuna. Warning, which, by the way, again, conflates the use of Mucuna with pharmaceutical hardcore synthetic Ldopa. And implicitly sort of doesn't understand just how long a person has to take hardcore synthetic Ldopa or dopamine agonist to run into troubling effects. Then Mark reads that warning, internalizes it, and then when asked in another forum, like say it comes up somewhere in a Facebook group or whatever, basically parrots the same thing. And as you might imagine, Bert, Kyle parrots the same information to another person in another forum. And before you know it, 40,000 people that have come to read this over the course of 4 years, and this perpetuating process of people spreading the initial guys misguided warning, think that Mucuna is a bad supplement to take, it's dangerous, and they write it off completely. This is how internet myths are perpetuated. And, I don't want to sound like over dramatic or something, but that has real life consequences, because then you have people that can benefit substantially from taking something like Mucuna and not take their ADHD medication or not have to go on something like Adderall, just as an example, but they turn away from it because they read that stuff on the web, and then they listen to their doc who ultimately wants to sell them fucking Adderall. So these kind of myths, they're all over the place. It's just like, a Drafanil causes liver damage, and there's no research to back that up. It's really just a guy that started this notion of because a Drafanil has to convert to modafinil in the liver, that sometimes could be hard on the liver and whatever, but there's no literature behind that. There's really even no reason to assume that happens. So things like grains are inherently bad for humans, and look, I know people with certain gut problems cannot tolerate grains well. It doesn't mean it's bad for everybody. There's plenty of people with really healthy digestive systems that tolerate grains incredibly well, and they're healthy for those people. Look, there are factions of the internet who have convinced themselves that the number one source for energy, the number one cellular energy source that their bodies and their brains are literally made for, carbohydrates, are toxic, bad, and can kill you. All misguided information. Look, Mucuna brightens my mood. It gives me energy to work, motivation to get things done. It's slightly stimulating, and honestly, I love taking it. And look, although it's powerful, it's actually subtle, compared to other dopaminergic compounds that I've taken like bromontane or 9-MEBC, and many other things which run the gamut that actually give you, high concentrations of L-dopamine, not the least of which is TRT, like we talked about yesterday. Now me being on TRT, I am releasing more dopamine. So my end assessment on, is Mucuna dangerous to take, or is it a supplement that is innocuous and that you can take with great benefit, is Mucuna is perfectly safe. Don't believe everything you read on the internet, folks. You got to get nuance about mechanisms and context. You got to go and read the research papers and truly understand what you're talking about, because the one characteristic that a lot of the warnings have in common is they're uber general. They're contextless, general. They don't cite any piece of literature, and it's just a very general sort of layman's take on the compound. All right, appreciate you guys being with me. Thank you so much for listening to my entire 20-minute spiel, or however long that was, on Mucuna. As I said at the beginning, a couple products support this broadcast, but they're epic nootropic products, and they're ours. First of them is the Cortex stack. Look, if you want concentrated dopamine energy. And dopamine energy is like a really great mood, the motivation to do things, and that sort of spark energy to get started on something that you're probably procrastinating on, as well as verbal fluency and memory enhancements. Buy the Cortex stack. That is our stack, been on the market for 9 years. Very powerful nootropic stack. You will not regret buying a bottle of Cortex. Do it now. You can do the description below or at livecortex.com. Secondarily, another stack you're not going to regret trying is the Torque stack. 6 to 8 hours of focus and clean stimulant energy. We built such a good stack in Torque. The feedback is insane. How much people repeat purchase and get on auto ship for Torque is it's honestly changed the course and the trajectory of our company. Anyway, you can buy it. You can literally buy what's being called the best nootropic stack on the internet that one can purchase at livecortex.com or down in the description of this video. video, go buy a bottle. You will not regret using Torque. It is strong, powerful, but clean. As I said also in the beginning, if you need to hire me for formulating nootropic stacks, building you an entire regimen, fixing your energy problems, optimizing your testosterone, or resolving major brain chemistry or energy issues, you can do that in under a minute at livecortex.com. Go book me. Some of you guys that are thinking about getting on a call with me, don't wait, just book it. You can do it again in under a minute, and you can get on a call with me as soon as tomorrow. For the rest of you, so much more content to come soon. I hope you have a great Sunday, and I'll talk to you next time.